Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we're joined by Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow, Becca Edwards, to help prepare for Earth Day, April 22nd. Becca's been meeting with many congregations talking about climate change, liberation theology, how communities of faith can engage on climate issues during this election season, and so much more. So we thought we would bring those conversations to you as you think about what you and your congregation can do this Earth Day and beyond. And one of the ways you can continue to engage this work is by joining Texas Impact's Climate Action Team. Find the link in the show notes or go to texasimpact.org to the Action Center and click to join a team. That's a good reminder that Texas Impact has all kinds of tools for you at texasimpact.org. You can join a legislative action team or our rapid response team, or you can help mobilize your congregation or community by using our Texas Faith Votes resources. If you have questions or need more information, you can always reach out at scott@texasimpact.org. I think that's enough wind up for today. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Becca Edwards. Joining us for today's conversation is Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow, Becca Edwards. Becca, you've been traveling a lot, speaking to a lot of groups. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. How are you?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
Well, we are certainly excited for the conversation. We're excited in part because Earth Day is coming up April 22nd, and we have a lot of folks excited for that. What are you reflecting on during the season?
So the first Earth Day in 1970 came out of identifying the fact that the way we defined progress in the past was causing all kinds of problems for our communities. We had really terrible air quality, really awful water quality. I think there's a lake in Ohio that actually caught on fire. So in recognition of these big environmental problems and the way industrial polluters had not previously been held accountable for the ways that their activities affected their communities, they had Earth Day, and it was a call for communities to gather and advocate for change at the federal level and policy toward regulating some of these industries and the way they polluted our air and water. And as we look towards our contemporary environmental issues that we're dealing with, those big successes like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which made such a big difference in our environmental quality, we need to have a similar revolution in the way we understand our environmental policy, and that in this moment, what that needs to take into consideration is the way that climate change is affecting our global climate and our communities and the environment all around us that we depend on for clean air and clean water and food security and those sorts of things. So as we're about 50 years out from the first Earth Day, the first one was a big success. We continue to build on that success, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about newly understood environmental problems like climate change that we should incorporate into our understanding of Earth Day.
I like that idea of a climate revolution. We do still have a lot of work that we need to do. And if we're going to do that well, faith communities will need to be at the forefront. Are there any best practices from communities of faith that you're aware of or that you'd hope that they'd consider moving into this Earth Day?
Sure. I would encourage faith communities to think beyond the individual actions that we've been told are the solution to our environmental problems. And I'm not saying that things like recycling and composting or even biking to work are not important. But I think that we need to consider more holistically our understanding of ourselves in relation to our neighbors and our attitudes towards our neighbors, and understanding the systems that we live in and how they affect the people around us and how do they affect the environment. So care for the environment goes so far beyond the individual contributions we can make. And that really is in opposition to the idea that most Americans have, or that we've been taught as Americans, that we are the thing that determines our security, that if we just have enough stuff in our house, that we have the right kind of house in the right neighborhood, And even that places us into competition with our neighbors. And that leads to all sorts of difficulties with communication and finding solutions. And I think in our faith communities, we have a real opportunity to consider a new way, a better way of relating to our neighbor and to thinking about our own security as bound up in the security of our communities. And those are the kinds of changes that will lead to lasting and holistic change in the way we think about our environment, the way we interact with our environment, the way we support each other, and the way the faith communities can be a conscience for the state and the way those policies about the environment and about our lives can be changed.
And speaking of those congregations, you've been out talking to a lot of them over the course of especially the last month, seemingly everywhere. When you're out talking with faith communities, what's your messaging right now?
Sure. Well, I say in faith traditions, in all faith traditions, not just my own Protestant Christian faith tradition, but there's a call for care for the other and a call to care for creation. And I see those two as intrinsically connected. We cannot love our neighbor without caring for the creation that we all depend on for our security, for our food, for our clean air, and for our clean water that we need to live, to have healthy lives where we can thrive. And our environmental choices for too long have threatened the ability of our environment to support us and in our lives of thriving and dignity. Climate change is even, in addition to the environmental issues of like air and water pollution, climate change threatens the very stability of our planet. So we need to consider that when we're talking about caring for our neighbor. We need to incorporate climate change into that ethic of care for our neighbor. So churches have been wonderful at responding to natural disasters. Churches have been wonderful at feeding and housing people that need that kind of support. But I think a third thing the church needs to consider is advocating for climate policy and also incorporating understanding of climate change into our other activities. So when we are responding to a disaster, how can we prepare better knowing the impacts of climate change? When we are building houses in Appalachia, how can we build those in such a way that they will be resilient to climate going forward so that people are protected in an even better way for a longer period of time?
All right, Becca, I'm going to give you a chance to nerd out theologically here. And I know some of our listeners' ears are about to perk up because I know part of those presentations have focused on the intersection of liberation theology and climate change. So for those of us who haven't been to seminary or are familiar with the concept of liberation theology, talk to us about what that is and how it intersects with climate justice.
Sure. So liberation theology looks at the story that we see in Scripture as a story of God overcoming human systems of power on behalf of God's people. The biggest example in the Hebrew Bible, of course, would be the Israelites being delivered from slavery in Egypt. And in the Gospels, again and again, we see Jesus questioning and critiquing human systems of power. For Jesus, the people he saw as holding their power unfairly, as holding their power in ways that led to oppression, were the Pharisees and the Romans. So liberation theology takes all of those stories together and finds that the fundamental theme of the human-God relationship is one of liberation, of God working on behalf of the oppressed and of God delivering God's people from that oppression. Gustavo Gutierrez is called the father of liberation theology, and he grew up quite poor in Peru and went on to become a priest and become highly educated. So he had a lot of familiarity with the idea of economic oppression from his own perspective as a child and also from his educational background. And he tied these ideas from Scripture to the idea of liberation for the poor in the contemporary world. And he sees poverty as a form of economic oppression in that poverty results from policy choices. So it is a form of economic oppression. He developed the idea of God's preferential option for the poor. And that doesn't mean that God prefers poor people or likes some people better than others. It just means that God is on the side of the marginalized and that God is working for their liberation. So the reason I turn to liberation theologians when I'm talking about environmental issues is because it focuses on systems of power as the root of oppression. So in the case of climate change, it is our systems of power that keep us tied to the fossil fuel economy. It affects that system is reflected in everything from the way we build our cities that continues to make us dependent on individual vehicles, all the way up to the way we do our electoral politics, where people with big money are able to influence the system in ways that people without that influence are not. So liberation theology has sort of lots of tools to look at that oppression and to give people of faith motivation to understand that God is working in the universe to liberate us from those systems of oppression. And another thing that Gutierrez points out is that when some people are oppressed, we are all oppressed. So as long as we have this group of people that's being oppressed by these systems of power, all of us stand to lose. So it is to all of our benefits to join God in the work in the world of undoing those systems of oppression.
I also like that it centers the conversation on marginalized communities. And I say that because a lot of times when we're talking about climate, folks on the other side of the argument, I think there was maybe a Texas legislator a couple years ago that said he didn't care so much about polar bears. He wanted to focus on people in his own community. And I think focusing the climate argument on liberation theology or on marginalized communities reminds us that the real impacts of climate change, of environmental injustice, hit low-income communities harder than others. And so I think it works for me, and I know it works for a lot of congregations to think about not just the impact on trees and climate, which is important, but also the impact that this has on low-income communities, our low-income neighbors, and focusing on this issue from that perspective. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And, no shade to the polar bears, but I do think
I like polar bears. I root for them.
Yeah. So I do think that we're growing in our understanding of the way climate change affects people. And that's driving some of the interest we've seen recently in solutions, which is a good thing. But certainly climate change is sort of the justice issue that connects all other justice issues. Marginalized groups are the ones that bear the most significant impacts of climate change. They're the ones least able to adapt to it. And people with resources, people like, especially in the West, like the United States, are the ones who have benefited the most from burning fossil fuels. So it's a very fundamental justice issue, one that liberation theology speaks particularly well to. And so I really think it's an opportunity for people of faith to consider the role of policy solutions in this conversation.
Amen. So speaking of communities and people that we care about in our communities and our neighbors, we are moving into general election season. And I know that many think it's important that climate be at the forefront of the conversations this cycle. What should Texans of faith be looking for? What should we be looking for in candidates? What should listeners be talking to candidates about during this important season?
So I would encourage people to look at the records of each candidate when it comes to their approach to the environment. So does the candidate support expanding the Clean Air Act to include greenhouse gases? Does the candidate understand the importance of looking at the most recent science and the best science available when developing policy solutions to mitigate climate change? A big one for me is, does the candidate value the kind of international cooperation required to address the climate crisis? One thing that really struck me at COP is the way that the negotiations are handled allow even the smallest country to have an equal voice as the largest. And so I think that's a model that any leadership in the U.S. Should adopt when talking about climate policy internationally and solutions, because some of those, as I said earlier, the biggest impacts of climate change are borne by the people who have the least responsibility for it. And that includes like our small island nations and our neighbors in the global south. So they have lots of experience with the impacts of climate change. And I think that their voice and their experience is very important in guiding particularly energy policy in the U.S. and any climate mitigation policy must include energy. So does the candidate understand those subtleties and does the candidate value that kind of cooperation? In Texas, certainly one of our biggest issues is energy, of course. And so in Texas, all climate policy is energy policy. We are the biggest energy producing state in the U.S. And the decisions that we make here at a state level directly influence the ability of the United States to reach its nationally determined contributions, which is the estimate of what we can contribute to the international effort to mitigate climate change. And one thing that's especially important now is to recognize that renewable energy has improved significantly in terms of reliability and cost over the last couple of decades. And it actually, since Texas is another top producer of renewable energy, many may not know that, but and it has proven to be especially useful in avoiding the kind of blackouts we were worried might happen during times of peak demand this summer. So given the environment that we are in now, the right regulatory environment would really promote building out of renewables and improving the systems that we have now. And that stands to benefit Texans in many ways, including grid stability, cost to the consumer, and also to mitigate our emissions of climate change. So an understanding of that role of renewables and the importance of improving access to them is really important. So I would look at a candidate's record of understanding of that, how they voted in the past, if they've been in positions of power. Do they understand that we need to make some progress on our energy options beyond what we've considered in the past? So I guess a holistic understanding of our energy environment, the way it's changing, and the kinds of improvements that need to be made would be sort of number one in my consideration of any Texas candidate.
To be clear, I'm in favor of grid stability. I like, all of my electricity to work. When we think about climate, we usually think about federal policy. You've mentioned the important components here in the state of Texas, but a lot of the work is being done at the local level. And so we also have to be paying attention to city council races and county races, right?
Of course, yes. So one of the issues that sort of rose to the top during our time at the UN climate negotiations in Dubai in November is that the kinds of decisions we make at the international level must be implemented by communities at the local level. So that's state and local government, city council, as you mentioned, county government. So they are they call it the implementation crisis. So we make these decisions at one level, and then we implement the changes needed at a different level. So how do we bridge that gap? I was at a conference last week, the South Central Regional Climate Adaptation and Resilience. I forget the exact name.
I was going to say, nice job remembering that if you've got it.
It was pretty close. It wasn't perfect. But it was a gathering of state and local government with climate scientists and other kinds of climate leaders. And I was super inspired by the work that's being done in our cities. Dallas has the CPAC. It's a nationally recognized climate action plan that involves all levels of government, all functions of local government, from transportation to wastewater to food. And the way they developed it is really inspiring to me, because they got all the stakeholders possible into a room and said, we are not leaving until we have a suite of of projects that we can implement that will improve our city in numerous ways. And one of the fun things about local government is that you can see really quick impacts of your project. And so when they were developing their plan, they looked at each possible intervention in the city government, and they thought, what are the co-benefits of this intervention? So adding transit, for example, adding a bus route or a light rail or something like that, it certainly reduces our reliance on fossil fuels. It reduces our emission of climate harming pollutants, and also it improves mobility. It gives car owners an option for traveling. It reduces congestion on our highways, and it improves access to our cities and our transportation for people that are not able to drive or are not able to have a car or would prefer not to have a car. So I think a lot of these climate solutions that we're looking at, especially at the city level, when applied creatively, stand to benefit in numerous areas instead of just climate. So I think there's a real opportunity to sort of rework the way we have been doing things and the way we've been thinking about things for generations to address many justice issues alongside addressing climate pollution.
Love that, folks. We have a lot of work to do during this important election year. Becca, really appreciate the time. I usually ask guests who don't work with me for shameless plugs, but I'm going to give you an opportunity because I know you have a program to plug where folks can get more involved. So talk to us about that.
Yes. So April 19th, we're launching our climate action team, which is a group of people interested in the kind of policy that will mitigate climate change at all different levels. As I said, all the way from local up to international. We'll be gathering weekly on Fridays at 10 a.m. on Zoom. And if you join, you're welcome to come when you can and not worry about it when you can't. We'll have education and discussion. We'll have action projects, and we will work together to address climate change in our communities. I hope you can join us.
Love that. Becca, thank you so much for the time today, and thanks for all the work you're doing for a better Texas.
Great. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Becca, and I hope everyone finds an opportunity to do something meaningful this Earth Day. Climate and environmental issues will definitely be on the ballot at about every level of state government this year, so if you care about the climate, it's time to get organized. Join the Climate Action Team, talk to candidates, participate in the Texas Faith Votes campaign. For your tools to do all of that, check out our website at texasimpact.org. While you're there, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions about any of it, please reach out. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.